We'll get started at the bottom of page 1 of our PDF Shabbat service. Do you want to make sure you're muted until we get to responsive readings? Hine ma tovu manai shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tovu manai shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tovu manayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tovu manayim shevet achim gam yachad. Shabbat Shalom, and thanks for joining us for our Zoom service. We have a special guest speaker tonight. We begin our service together in the middle of page 1. You can find the link to the PDF in your Shabbat email, and if anyone needs the link, I posted it in the chat and can repost it if needed. Pieces coming together. One part of Judaism is called Tikkun Olam. It says that the world has been broken into pieces, all this chaos, all this discord. And our job, everyone's job, is to try to put the pieces back together, to make things whole again. Maybe we're the pieces. Maybe what we're supposed to do is come together. That's how we end the brokenness. So at this point in our service, I invite us all to think about the week that has passed and to hold on to all of the good things from this past week. So if you had an experience that inspired gratitude, if you have some good news to share, no matter how big or how small, I invite you to unmute or to share in the comments section, whatever it was that inspired gratitude this week. So I'll just say that it's been lovely to see more children ages 5 and up getting vaccinated this week. Some are already getting their second dose, which is wonderful news. And Mazel Tov, Jackson, on your job interview. I hope it goes well. And we thank God for all of the blessings in life, including the blessing of life itself, with the words of Shehechianu on the bottom of page 4. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shehechianu v'kimanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. And now we continue on the top of page 5 with the responsive reading. I'm going to ask one person to unmute so we can hear your voice represent the community's voice for the italicized text. So would anyone like to be our first volunteer? We've got a few readings, so we'll have multiple chances if you don't want to go first. Marilyn, do you have the text?
I'll unmute if nobody else has it.
All right, thank you, Stan. We cannot merely pray to God that wars should be ended, for we know that the world is made in such a way that we must find the path to peace within ourselves and with our neighbors.
We cannot merely pray for God and starvation, We already have been given the resources with which to feed the entire world if we would only use them wisely.
We cannot merely pray to God to root out prejudice, for we have already been given the insight with which to see the good in all people, if we would only view them with understanding.
We cannot merely pray for God to end despair, for we have already been given the power to give help to the helpless, and hope to the hopeless, if we would only use our power justly.
We cannot merely pray for God to end disease, for we have already been given minds with which to seek out cures and healings, if we would only use them constructively.
Therefore, we pray instead for strength, determination, and willpower. Do instead of only to pray, become instead of merely to wish.
Thank you, Stan. So we turn to page 8, and we'll do an abbreviated version of Lecha Dodi, Boi Kala, just the last line and then the first 2 lines. Boi Kala, Boi Kala, Boi Kala, Boi Kala. Boi Kala, Boi Kala, Boi Kala, Boi Kala. Lecha Dodi, Likrat Kala, Pene Shabbat Nekabela. Boi Kala, Boi Kala, Boi Kala, Boi Kala. Boi Kala, Boi Kala, Boi Kala, Boi Kala, Boi Kala. And we continue with our official call to worship, the Baruch Hu, near the middle of page 9. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Barechu et Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Adonai HaMevorach, HaMevorach Leolam Vaed. HaMevorach, HaMevorach Leolam Vaed. And we continue with our next responsive reading in the middle of page 10 with We Believe. Can I get another volunteer who has the text? If not,
I can volunteer.
Wonderful, Ed. Thank you. We believe in tomorrow.
We believe that we have the power to make a difference. We believe we have a power to make tomorrow different from today.
We believe that poverty need not be permanent, that we need not learn war forever.
We believe in humanity despite that all we know about it.
We believe that there can yet be a time of peace, of justice, and of love for all who live on earth.
We believe we can share in bringing that day closer by the way in which we live.
Let people everywhere be sure that every deed counts, that every word has power.
And that we all can do our share to redeem the world.
In spite of all its absurdities and frustrations and disappointments.
Let us remember to build a life as if we were a work of art.
We continue with the Shema on the bottom of page 10. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. 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 Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Page 11. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha bechol levavcha ubechol nafshecha ubechol me'odecha ve'hayu hadvarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzavecha hayom al levavecha v'shinatam levanecha v'dibarta bam B'shivtecha b'beitecha, u'v'lechtecha b'derech, u'v'shochbecha u'v'kumecha, u'kshartam leot al yadecha, v'hayu letotafot b'neinecha, u'chtavtam al mezuzot beitecha, u'v'isharecha, leman tizkeru, v'asitem et kol mitzvotai, Vitam Kadoshim Elohechem, Ani Adonai Elohechem, Asher Hotzeiti Etchem, Me'eretz Mitzrayim, Le'ot Lachem Elohim, Ani Adonai Elohechem. And we continue together on page 13. Can I get another volunteer to be the voice of the community for courage?
Yes. Oh, hi. Courage is the strength to stand up.
That's what she's supposed to say.
I'm sorry. Oh, excuse
It's
me.
okay. We haven't done this on Zoom in a very long time. I think we forgot this format. Courage is the strength to stand up when it's easier to fall down and lose hold. It is the conviction to explore new horizons when it's easier to believe what we've been told.
Courage is the desire to maintain our integrity when it is easier to look the other way. It is feeling happy and alive and moving forward when it is easier to feel sorry for ourselves and stay.
Courage is the will to shape our world when it's easier to let someone else do it for us. It is the recognition that none of us are perfect when it's easier to criticize others and fuss.
Courage is the power to step forward and lead when it is easier to follow the crowd. Their pleas resound. It is the spirit that places you on top of the mountain when it is easier to never leave the ground.
The foundation of courage is solid, the rock that doesn't roll. Courage is the freedom of our mind, body, and soul. And we continue with Mi Chamocha, the bottom of page 14. Ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la la ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la la ya la 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 ya la 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 la. Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh, nora tehilot osefele, nora tehilot osefele. And we continue in the middle of page 15 with Vishamru. Vishamru, V'nei Yisrael, Eta Shabbat לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם, אותי לעולם, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. וביום השביעי שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. And we continue with our last responsive reading on the top of page 15. Is there anyone who's willing to unmute and be the voice of the community? Joel? In each human hand and heart is the power to renew life.
Oh, come on, Marilyn. I am lost. I'm sorry.
We're on page 15 at the top in the world's tiniest font. Can you see it?
Okay. To see dignity where there is brokenness and defeat, to know and cherish the image of God in every human face.
To open eyes that have closed in despair, to shelter the weak and shield the helpless.
To give strength to the weary, hope and comfort to those who feel pain.
To care for the earth like an old friend, to give its oceans, rivers, and forests our selfless love. To treat ponds and tide pools, the sky and the mountains as sacred living beings.
In each of us is the power to renew life.
Thank you. And now we turn to page 16 for the central prayer of our worship, the Amidah. Adonai sefatai tiftachu pi agitehi latecha. Adonai, open up my lips and my mouth may declare your glory. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu v'imotenu, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, v'Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Leah, Elohei Rachel. Ha'el Hagadol, Hagibor ve'hanora, El Elyon, Gomer Chasadim Tovim, Ve'konei Hakol, Ve'zocher Chasdei Avot ve'imahot, U'mevi ge'ula lifnei bneihem, Le'ma'an shemo be'ahava. Melech Ozer u'Moshiach u'Magin. Baruch atah Adonai. Magen Avraham ve'ezrat Sarah. Atah gibor le'olam Adonai. Mechayei hakol atah rab lehoshia. Mechalkel chayim bechesed. Mechayei hakol berachamim rabim. Somech noflim verofech olim, umatir asurim, umekayem emunato, mishenei afar, michamocha ba'al gevurot, umidomelach, melech mimit umechayeh, ומצמיח ישועה, ונאמן אתה לחיות הכל. ברוך אתה אדוני, מחיי הכל. And we take a moment for personal prayer or reflection. We continue on the top of page 18. Shalom Rav Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Shalom Rav Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Ki ata hu melech Adon lechol hashalom. Ki ata hu melech Adon lechol hashalom. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha tasim leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha tasim leolam. B'tov be'enecha levarech et amcha Yisrael b'chol עת ובכל שעה בשלומך. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha tasim leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha tasim leolam. Tasim leolam. Tasim leolam. And at this point in our service, we think of loved ones who are in need of healing. Tonight, we think especially of Beth Levine, Rabbi Jerry Levy, Elaine Rigoni, Jean Sanders, and Sam Berkeley. Are there other loved ones whose healing we wish to pray for tonight? If so, I invite you to unmute yourselves or share their names in the comments section.
Terry Heifetz,
The other grandfather, Gary Patterson.
Jason
My
Kessler.
grandmother and a student's mother was just tested positive for COVID at my school.
With the power of community, we pray for their refuah shlema, their complete healing of body and or spirit, with the words of Misha Berach found at the bottom of page 20. Misha Berach Avotenu Mekor HaBracha Leimotenu. May the source of strength, who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Misha Berach Imotenu Mekor HaBracha Le'avotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen. And we continue on page 22 with the Aleinu prayer. Aleinu leshabeach la'adon hakol, לתת גדולה ליוצא בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי ארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא, ונאמר, והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו echad. And at this point in our service, we think of loved ones who have passed away recently or at this time in years past. Tonight, we remember with love Jeff Galston, longtime member of ORME, the father of Cynthia and Ariel Galston, and the yahrzeit of Betty Arthur, mother of Keith Arthur, Harry Haken, grandfather of Jeff Haken, Bernard Matz, uncle of Art Matz, Alice Sukro, grandmother of Keith Arthur, and Shirley Zlotowitz, mother of Adrian Ferris. Are there other loved ones who we wish to remember tonight? If so, please unmute yourselves and share their name or share their name in the comment section. Zichronam livracha, may their memories always be a blessing. Continue as a community of support with the Mourners Kaddish on page 24. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, be'alma divrach yiruteh v'yamlich malchuteh, b'chayechon uvyomechon uv'chaye dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala uv'izman kariv v'imru amen. Yehi shmei Rabbah Mivarach le'olam olamei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalal shmei dekudesha brichu. Le'ela mikol birchata v'shirata. Tush bechata v'nechamata. Da'amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya. V'chayim alenu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom bimromav. Hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru amen. May the source of peace send peace to all who mourn, and may we be a source of comfort for all who are bereaved, and let us say, amen. And we conclude our service tonight, the top of page 25, with Lo Yisa Goy. Eyo, oh, Eyo, oh, Lo yisa goy el goy cherev, lo yilmedu od milchama. Lo yisa goy el goy cherev, lo yilmedu od milchama. Eyo, oh, Eyo, oh, And now it is my honor to introduce our guest speaker tonight. Dr. Hyojin Im is an associate professor at VCU's School of Social Work, and her research is centered on the intersection between trauma and culture. She is passionate about linking local and global practices and policies for seamless refugee programs and sustainable interventions. She has worked with statewide refugee mental health programs in Kentucky, Maine, Minnesota, Texas, and now Virginia, promoting community empowering wellness interventions and peer-led initiatives for culturally responsive, trauma-informed care for refugee newcomers. Her insights around refugee trauma and healing are of particular value to our congregational community as we begin our own sacred work of helping a recently resettled family of refugees from Afghanistan. So I'm going to spotlight our guest speaker, and she'll share with us a presentation including a PowerPoint. So thank you so much, Dr. In.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Ahuva, for inviting me to speak with you. And good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me. And can you see my slide? Okay, great. It's a beautiful service, and it's my great pleasure to meet with you virtually. And I feel so grateful for your interest in the support. Actually, I didn't know until now that many of you are already really kind of planning for hosting some newcomers, and it's a wonderful to hear that. And I really feel grateful for your support for the Afghan families in particular. So, because we recently, heard, horrific news from Afghanistan and even other continued conflicts and refugee crisis in many parts of the world. And I just feel like this is a really wonderful opportunity to share maybe some of my work, but also my personal kind of journey until I get here. Because I work in the US and a few other countries like Kenya, Malaysia, Vietnam, and most of all, actually my home country, Korea. So just briefly, I want to show you some pictures of my kind of journey a little bit. So last year, actually, June 25th was the 70th anniversary of the Korean War. I was born in a city called Busan in South Korea, which once became the capital city, actually, of Korea because of the war, and pretty much the only safe sanctuary city for kind of internally displaced people from all across Korean Peninsula. And the city has been ever expanding and growing by the people who have lost their home and settled in this city, calling it a new home. So my father's family was one of them. And this is the settlement site during the war, known as the refugee camp or settlers town. Interesting thing is that I never lived here or experienced this place myself, but this is my legal permanent residency in Korea, or domicile in Korea, which is sort of based on, where your father was born. So growing up in a family in a city with such memories of war and the history of displacement really motivated me to study psychology in college and graduate school to answer some questions about how society and individuals can be healed from such massive social conflicts and collective trauma. So I didn't know the term like cultural trauma or even PTSD back then, like when I was a kid, but I was deeply affected by, those kind of questions and the atmosphere of the city and my family history. And I learned psychology, especially cultural psychology, and kind of wanting to understand how, different communities experience different kind of the belief systems and how differently they may affect their experiences of trauma and mostly social suffering and other kind of the healing journey as well. So actually the city doesn't look like that anymore, of course, and of course it's one of the kind of the largest actually harbor city, my hometown. I don't know, maybe I cannot really share all of these in detail, but this is kind of pretty much a collage of some photos of my personal and professional journey to answer those questions. So I came to the US for my PhD education in social work. Especially I wanted to kind of do some, restorative justice. So my first winter in the US, it was of course very cold. And I was working with many different kind of the great communities and organizations. And the first kind of project was working with the Liberian TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They actually hosted the public hearings in St. Paul in 2008. And I also work with the Center for Victims of Torture and many kind of the wonderful communities, especially in Minnesota. We had the largest Somali community outside of Africa. So I very closely work with that community in particular. And that kind of work made me want to trace back to the source of trauma to better understand where healing process and the suffering started and how they continue. So during my doctoral study, I actually went to Kenya, the Dadaab refugee camp, which is near the border of between Somalia and Kenya, which is actually once the largest refugee camp in the world, hosting 500,000 refugees in the site that was designed for only 90,000 people soon after the Somali Civil War. And I cannot maybe go through all the details, but I had a tremendous experiences working with the community leaders, community youth, and focusing a lot on the the resilience in the community, and without even former services or kind of policy backed support, what can we do as a community to get healed from the trauma that deeply kind of affected our or the mind and the relationships and spirituality and so on. So perhaps there are two most penetrating words in refugee experiences as well as my research with this community. And the first word, I guess, is trauma. So as we learned from many studies and even life experiences, healing and recovery from trauma is heavily dependent on empathetic support from families or surrounding people and the community. So feeling helpless and isolated is the core experiences of psychological trauma. And on contrast, the empowerment and reconnection are the core experiences of recovery. So this is one of my favorite quotes about trauma. Dr. Peter Levine said, trauma is not simply what happened to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. And as you can imagine, an empathetic witness can be a person who provides support or simply gives their presence when someone is suffering. And it can be also attuning to the person, the afflicted person, and showing compassion and care and listening with acceptance and without judgment. So to somebody having been through a traumatic experience, being seen or heard and understood can be just a healing. And if there's no empathetic witness, what the person would feel is just a sense of victimhood. And as you can imagine, refugee community members have gone through many different forms of tremendous trauma during migration and even resettlement. Specific types of trauma may be unique to or more common within each phase of migration. I may not need to go in detail here, but I just want to empathize that how traumatic experiences continue throughout the refugee journey, and refugees always face dual sources of distress in the US. One is the the strain of past traumas, and the other is current factors of acculturative stress. So some people call this acculturation stress adaptive disorder or even adaptation disease, because long-term exposure to such stress can cause physical and psychological problems, and even some severe illness and disability. For recovery or resilience from trauma, definitely it takes some steps. There is a very one of the most influential and classic books on trauma healing called Trauma and Recovery by Judith Harmon. She's one of the co-founder of the Harvard Refugee Trauma Center. So this book shows a 3-stage model of healing process of traumatized individuals. And the first and the foremost step is to establish safety and stability, both physically and psychologically. And this step involves learning and practicing emotional regulations and managing symptoms through self-care and healthy coping skills. And the second step is a remembering and mourning stage through processing painful losses in traumatic memories. This stage is not always happening or encouraged for everybody. To some people, just thinking and talking about painful memories is not necessarily not helpful or required for their healing. But other people may find that memories are no longer disruptive and feel like they need some kind of closure to traumatic past. The third stage is reconnection to normal life through reconciliation with themselves and other people. Another key term also that I thought would, characterize refugee experiences is perhaps culture. So cultural challenge, cultural barriers, cultural differences, and so on. As someone working with this community, I kind of feel that the systematic neglect of culture is perhaps the single biggest barrier to health, mental health, and also just the overall wellness. So I deeply agree with this statement that the culture is the one largest barrier that we experience as a system or even sometimes as a community. So in spite of the tremendous trauma and emotional suffering, the concept of mental health or mental health care unfortunately doesn't exist in every cultural group. Actually, most refugee communities don't even have a word equivalent to mental health. And people are genuinely afraid and hesitant to talk about traumatic experiences or even just their emotional suffering or any symptoms, because it may hurt their family and themselves. It brings a lot of shame and guilty feeling to them. And it's also common to see high level of mistrust or misinformation around, even mental health care or just healthcare in general. Or even some people may have a very different conception about the lifestyle or value system in the US. So this might be a little bit extreme kind of the example, but I just want to share this with you. One Somali family who I interviewed, it's not just a one family, but there are many actually repeated kind of the sort of, the stories around how their expectations are not met after coming to the US. She said, one of the moms said, I was one of those people who thought in the US there are walls where we just withdraw money. Instead of money, I received an abundance of snow. Of course, this is a very extreme case, and I thought it's always kind of funny to talk about weather and snow in Minnesota. But I think that there are a lot of the expectations are based on, social media, that are not maybe accurate, and also maybe a lot of the American pop culture and the movies and the songs and so on that are not necessarily kind of reflecting the reality that we live in. And also many people experience very negative, the kind of the political and systematic oppressions in the home country already. So the mistrust and very traumatic experiences are very common in this population. Some people even told me that the actually Hmong woman who I interviewed mentioned that it was almost 30 years before we interviewed, but she still cried and kind of mentioned that how terrible the experience was in the camp. And it's not just maybe the camp, but people like people from Afghanistan, perhaps the oppressions that last for a long time by Taliban also kind of might have some kind of the related sort of the experiences. So she basically said that her uncle brought the daughter to hospital, but she couldn't come back because of maybe there was just some bad thing happened in the hospital. Whether it's true or not, but that is kind of the level of fear and the perception or mistrust in the system. So as a result of previous negative experiences and different health seeking patterns and maybe lack of cultural orientation and so many other factors, people usually suffer in silence, even though they have lots of things going on in their mind and the relationship or even the spirituality. So self-medication or self-treatment is one of the options for some people. A lot of people actually hold anger inside and self-harm can happen. I heard that a lot from Afghan girls in particular because of the stress. And there are many kind of things that like, the kind of mental and behavior health issues kind of sort of, you know, uh, manifested in children and young kids, but parents sometimes don't know exactly what is going on because of the communication and the cultural gap between even parents and children become one of the internal sort of the family kind of barrier in household. And one of the common also sort of the strategies around the mental health issues I found was sending people with the issues just back home country or some other places. Of course, it's a maybe very extreme case, but in Somali community and other people from especially the African countries, chaining or hiding the person who they think is problematic. And traditional healing, some are maybe empowering, but not all of them are. So some might be very harmful. So, think about the complexity of trauma impacts on individuals and families and the intercultural communication barriers and gaps. It is not surprising that refugees often filter their own experiences based on a number of considerations, such as what symptoms are, maybe attributed to the trauma experiences they had, or what hurts the most, and what is considered the most problematic or most meaningful and the most appropriate to talk about, and the most likely to get some support from others. And not everything can be acknowledged in this process. And some topics are culturally prohibited, like political oppression or very gender sensitive topics, for example. So those can also create additional filters. So oftentimes what we hear is just, I'm fine. So Rabbi Ahuva shared with me earlier that many people would be interested in knowing what and how uh, you can help, provide support for the refugee community, especially those who just went through, horrendous traumatic events and forced migration, like Afghan families. I'm not sure if this is the most relevant information, or maybe these also maybe not just new to you, but I wanted to briefly share a few thoughts. Before mentioning this, I actually have to mention that Marilyn is here. I was very happy to see her here. And I have to say, she was actually one of the most resourceful and instrumental person when I first came to Richmond. So I'm sure she will share lots of other ideas and tips around this too. But first, I want to mention that there are lots of volunteering opportunities if you're not hosting family in the house. I think these are some of the names, some of the areas that definitely we can consider. But I think the most important thing is asking directly what they would need and what kind of even donations or voluntary work make most sense to the families and the agencies or context. So I just want to briefly mention that volunteering with the refugee resettlement agencies or community-based organizations will be a really nice idea, but also since many Afghan families actually, some of them at least can speak English. So I think the working directly with maybe some community leaders wouldn't be a bad idea. And interfaith outreach, like Islamic Center of Virginia, actually does a lot of work with the Afghan kind of faith leaders as well. And also, I maybe this might be a little bit kind of long-term thing, but I also want to mention that there are many direct and indirect way to advocate for more humane refugee resettlement process, like taking away the expectations to repay their cost of travels, so that refugees don't arrive in the U.S. with a debt. Maybe advanced degree or senior level jobs that people had in their home country are not acknowledged and transferred here in the US. So most have a very few options beyond the minimum wage jobs. Annual refugee cap should always stay at the reasonable annual level. So for example, for the past years, we had a 30 something thousand of refugees per year, and now it went up to almost 150,000 in the upcoming year. So it's such a wild fluctuation in new arrivals made, or the refugee resettlement agencies and hosting communities very difficult to manage their operation and arrange resources. So there are many things that we can also advocate for the better refugee resettlement process. And I just put only a few kind of the training links here, and I can share with the maybe Rabbi Ahuva later if you want to. But I also want to mention that maybe some training or self-education might be wouldn't hurt before engaging with the refugee community. So one thing that I really liked was actually psychological first aid training that is basically an evidence-based intervention designed to help sort of kind of mitigate psychological distress and facilitate coping and functioning of people who just experience some tragic events or disasters. So one material is by WHO for kind of non professional, even field staffers or paraprofessionals or volunteers. And the other one is a self-paced online training modules by National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And then the last one at the bottom is actually it's a 90-minute session by Switchboard and IRC, International Rescue Committee presentation. So I recommend you to take a look at them and feel free to reach out to me for any resources that you need or any information that I could provide. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Im. If anyone has any questions, you can ask aloud. You want to unmute yourself, or you can also type them in the chat and I can read them aloud for you.
Are there any organizations right now that are working to create a more ethical process for resettlement that we can like join and like help?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that everybody, first of all, everybody try really hard. I think the one of the challenge that refugee resettlement agencies face is the unexpected, like unpredictability. Sometimes they don't know even which groups are coming in, which is very, maybe it makes sense because we don't know which areas has more, conflicts and the international crisis. But I think they're trying really hard to make this more reasonable and kind of better for both refugee newcomers and their staff. So I cannot really say that one particular organization is better than others, but I think the overall refugee resettlement agencies really try hard. So that's why maybe volunteers who are especially a little bit well trained will be very beneficial. In some localities, not necessarily Richmond area yet, but Northern Virginia, for example, there are lots of refugee-led organizations. So the refugee themselves actually kind of to help each other. I think that is a very, very sustainable and very culturally sensitive models. So if you want to work with any organization, I think that pretty much every resettlement agencies nowadays kind of really try hard and lots of precaution around the training before you actually can interact with people. So I think maybe I really didn't answer your question directly, but yeah, but I'm happy to share with the names of the organizations if you want to.
Yeah, I would love that. That'd be great.
Yeah. So you can directly also reach out to me. My email is actually very easy. It's a him. So send me email to him@vcu.edu. I always say, don't send it to her. It's just him. So this is my email address. So
Easy to remember.
thank you.
Hello, Dr. Him. I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about the children who are coming with the families, in terms of school, in terms of, getting acclimated to their social groups, at age level. How does that work, and what are your recommendations in that regard?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. First of all, I'm not a real expert in child trauma, but what I know is children are, first of all, very resilient. We know that. So, and also one tricky part is even though children has that kind of the traumatic sort of the impacts in their body or their mind and, the way of their thinking, it's really hard to sort of catch. First of all, when refugees come to the US, we really recommend them to take mental health screening so that we can provide us some support. But the current screening tool isn't really for the children. So only it's the age 14 and above. And it's not mandatory. So I think first of all, it's really hard to detect, but we see children are usually very resilient. But the more concerning part is not maybe the initial kind of resettlement phase, but 6 months after or a year after, when they're not, their settlement experiences are not going very well. I think that a lot of people kind of start showing some symptoms of stress and even trauma. So that's very kind of the common, whether they're adults or children. And I think the age groups are really wide, but lots of teenage, kids to very young children. The cases that I heard of experienced with the African community is like a teenage girls, especially the culture sort of dramatic sort of the exposure, like, the transition to the US American culture really creates some tensions even within the family. So the lots of family conflicts, sometimes family dynamics kind of shift a lot. So the father always, being very authoritative, I mean, traditionally, but that kind of even gender role in family, the children, parents' role kind of switched in a way, because children really observed American culture and language very quickly, and father kind of feel very, kind of feel like losing the power and control in the house. So the gender dynamics are very interesting, and actually sometimes very kind of harmful to family relationship. So that is something that we always have to be in mind. And there's no right, wrong answer, but that's why I always kind of recommend everybody to work with the community leaders and community members together directly, because they actually have gone through that process maybe 5 years ago or even 3 years ago, so that they are more experienced and culturally more sensitive, and the kind of better communicate with the family directly, because a lot of the problem solving traditionally, in Afghanistan and other places is like there's some elders in the community who provide the wisdom and even kind of the resolution and reconciliation for the kind of the community members. So coming back to your original question about children, I think currently we don't have a separate school, to my understanding. If we to my understanding, we used to have a kind of separate, like a more traditional kind of the places, but a lot of students are just the sort of the exposed to the regular school very immediately. So I think the mentoring or tutoring even, they need a lot of help around that, and that might be a great way to sort of kind of exchange the cultural knowledge and understanding as well. So that's one thing that would be something, if you're interested. I think any of you might be interested. That's always I hear from the community that they need as well.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Do we have one last question?
I will also have to say that I'm not just saying this, but I'm so glad that Marilyn is here. So she is so resourceful again. So I kind of feel like I don't need to maybe just say so much here, but again, feel free to reach out to me if there's anything. I perhaps wouldn't have an answer to every question for sure, but I'd be happy to brainstorm together or share any resources that I have.
Yeah, this is David Dorfman. They are coming from Afghanistan. I don't know their, which Islamic community they're members of, but they're certainly not Jewish. What kinds of problems does that create, in that we are a Jewish community sponsoring them? Is that something we shouldn't be concerned about?
Thank you for the question. I think this is a very, it's a great question. I think definitely you will wonder, like, how different side of the world, right? So let me just share on my experience, because I'm immigrant myself. I came to the US not too many years ago, actually. So when I first came to the US, the first thing that I did was I always jokingly say that my advisor sent me to a jail. Actually, literally, my first work was in jail, and it was victim offender mediation. And oddly, the title that I had was community supporter or something, community support member. And then I was thinking, like, am I a community member? I mean, I just came from Korea, and I'm now in, in the middle of Minnesota Shakopee women's jail, and barely lived here, and I just feel so strange about it. And I work with a many faith-based organization, even though my family is Buddhist. I think the people wouldn't see this, like, the human to human relationship. I think when you don't care about that, like, where you're from, what your belief system is, it's maybe, I don't know, it's maybe too exaggerating, but I like dog, but I don't hate the people who likes cat. So I think that it's kind of the one part of us, but it's not just the same as me. And when we just welcome them with the open arms, I think they just see you as a human being first, and maybe the religion is one of the many things that you have. So that was my experience when I first engaged with the people. So I think the most important thing is just being a human, and learning. Maybe the culture is a mutual thing. So I'm not just teaching American culture to them, but they also can teach me what they're proud of. So I think that just being a human to human. I mean, yeah, maybe I'm repeating too much, but so you shouldn't worry about that. I'm happy to actually just to be here, no matter what religious organization I'm talking to, and I hope that you can also see me that way as well. Does it make sense? I don't know.
Yep, no, it's beautiful answers and an amazing presentation. So we're very lucky to have you present to our community tonight. And if you want to unmute, we can applaud our guest speaker.
Thank you so much.
You have her email address if you have any further questions. And I want to reiterate that I'm also glad to have Marilyn here in our community, because this has not been an easy process, but her experience, her skill, her wonderful humanity and passion for making this world a better place is definitely helping us do this mitzvah in a way that we wouldn't be able to do without her. So, and thank you to everyone else who has gone to the training and expressed interest and made donations and offered support in whatever ways that you can. Every little bit makes a difference, and we add that all together. We're able to make an incredible impact on another person and another family's life. So thank you all. And just want to say Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Shabbat shalom.
I'm going to close out the Zoom.
Good night. Good night.
Good night. Shabbat Shalom.